It's August 15th, 1971. You're settled in your living room, maybe with a snack, watching TV on a Sunday night. Suddenly, the program cuts to a special broadcast. President Richard Nixon appears on your screen, looking serious. He's about to make an announcement that will ripple through the entire global economy for decades to come. And here rests the crazy part: most Americans watching that night had absolutely no idea what he was really saying or what it truly meant for their future. In that speech, Nixon declared that the United States would no longer honor its promise to convert dollars into a fixed amount of gold. Just like that, with one television broadcast, he severed a relationship that had been the bedrock of the world's financial system for decades. The dollar, once as good as gold, was now backed by, well, nothing but trust. And as we all know, trust can be a very fragile thing. Now you might be thinking, wait a second, so our money isn't backed by gold anymore? What is it backed by then? That is a fantastic question, and it's exactly what we're going to dive into today. Because what happened on that August night wasn't just a simple policy change. It was the moment the US dollar, the currency in your pocket, came dangerously close to collapsing entirely. And somehow, against all odds, it survived to become the most powerful and dominant currency on the planet. So how did this happen? The story is way more dramatic than you might think. We're talking about secret meetings, international threats, and a high-stakes game of economic warfare. The dollar was literally just days away from becoming worthless paper. Let's rewind a bit to understand why this drastic step was even necessary. After World War II, the world's major economies gathered at a place called Bretton Woods. They agreed to a new system where their currencies would be pegged to the US dollar, and the US dollar, in turn, would be pegged to gold at a rate of $35 per ounce. This made the dollar the world's reserve currency. Any country holding dollars could, in theory, show up at the US Treasury and exchange them for physical gold. It was a promise, a golden guarantee. For a while, this system worked beautifully. It provided stability and helped rebuild a world shattered by war. But by the late 1960s, cracks started to appear. The US was spending massive amounts of money on the Vietnam War and on social programs at home. To pay for it all, it was printing more and more dollars. Other countries, especially in Europe, started to get nervous. They saw the US printing money like there was no tomorrow and thought, wait a minute, do they even have enough gold to back all these dollars? And they were right to be worried. The amount of dollars floating around the world far exceeded the US gold reserves. Countries like France and Switzerland started calling America's bluff. They began showing up and demanding their gold, and the US gold supply started to shrink at an alarming rate. It was like a run on the bank, but on a global scale. The US was in a tight spot. If everyone demanded their gold at once, the whole system would implode. The dollar would be exposed as an empty promise. This is where President Nixon and his advisors found themselves in that summer of '71. They were hemorrhaging gold. They had to do something, and they had to do it fast. So over a secret weekend meeting at Camp David, they cooked up a radical plan, what would later be known as the Nixon shock. They decided to slam the gold window shut. No more exchanging dollars for gold. Period. When Nixon made that announcement, it sent shockwaves across the globe. International markets were thrown into chaos. No one knew what a dollar was worth anymore. For a moment, it seemed like the dollar was in freefall, on the brink of becoming just paper. This was the moment the dollar almost died. But then something incredible happened. The dollar didn't just collapse. Instead, a new, unwritten system began to emerge. Countries still needed a stable currency to trade with each other, and the dollar was still the most widely held and used currency in the world. The US economy, despite its problems, was still the largest and most powerful on Earth. And then came the masterstroke. In the years that followed, the US made a series of strategic deals, most famously with Saudi Arabia. The agreement was simple: Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in US dollars. In return, the US would provide military protection and support. This system, known as the petrodollar, meant that any country that wanted to buy oil, which was pretty much every country, had to first get their hands on US dollars. This created a massive constant global demand for the dollar, not because it was backed by gold, but because it was backed by oil, the lifeblood of the modern economy. The dollar wasn't backed by a shiny metal in a vault anymore. It was backed by the full faith, credit, and economic might of the United States, and its necessity for global trade. So the day the dollar almost died actually became the day it was reborn, stronger and more flexible than ever before. It's a wild story of how a currency untethered from its golden anchor managed to not only stay afloat but completely dominate the world stage. It's a testament to how much of our modern financial world is built not on physical assets, but on trust, strategy, and power. To understand how close the world came to complete financial meltdown, we need to rewind the clock. Picture this. It's 1944. World War II is still tearing the globe apart, but the Allies are already looking ahead, planning for the peace. They meet in a quiet little town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods to design a new global economic system. And what they came up with was, frankly, brilliant. Or so it seemed. They created a system where every major currency was pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar itself? It was tied directly to gold. The promise was simple and felt unbreakable. Any country, at any time, could show up with 35 US dollars and exchange it for 1 ounce of pure gold. Guaranteed. This was the foundation of the Bretton Woods Agreement. Think about the sheer confidence of that statement. The United States essentially told the entire planet, trust our paper money, because we have the gold to back every single bill. And for a while the world did. Why wouldn't they? After the war, the US held nearly 2/3 of the world's entire gold supply. Fort Knox wasn't just a vault. It was a symbol of unshakable American economic power. This made the US dollar the world's reserve currency. Buying oil, trading with Japan, settling international debts, it all required dollars. The global economy was built on this golden promise. It was a golden age for American prosperity. We were literally printing the world's money, and everyone was eager to take it, confident in its value. But here is the catch with grand promises. They're only good as long as you can keep them. Now let's fast forward to the 1960s. The picture starts to change. America finds itself bogged down in an incredibly expensive war in Vietnam. At the same time, back home, President Lyndon Johnson is launching his ambitious Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, massive investments in education and urban renewal. All noble goals, but they came with a staggering price tag. So how did the government pay for it all? You guessed it. They fired up the printing presses and created more and more dollars. But wait, remember the promise? Every dollar is supposed to be backed by a fixed amount of gold. The problem was, the number of dollars floating around the world was exploding while the amount of gold sitting in Fort Knox was not. America was writing checks that its gold reserves could no longer cash. And other countries were starting to do the math. They were getting nervous. France, led by the fiercely independent President Charles de Gaulle, was the first to publicly challenge the system. In 1965, he basically said, "This dollar is losing its credibility. We'd rather have the gold, thank you very much." And he wasn't kidding. France began sending warships across the Atlantic, not for war, but to collect their gold from the New York Federal Reserve. Imagine that scene, French naval vessels pulling into New York Harbor to load up on American gold bars. It was a bank run on a global scale. Seeing this, other nations started to panic. Maybe France has the right idea, they thought. We should get our gold while we still can. Soon, Britain, Germany, Switzerland, and Japan all started lining up to trade their dollars for gold. With every shipload of gold that left American shores, the nation's reserves dwindled. By 1971, the situation was critical. The numbers were terrifying. The U.S. had roughly $11 billion worth of gold left. But there were over 60 billion US dollars in foreign hands. If even a handful more countries decided to cash in, the United States would have to default on its promise. The entire post-war financial system was teetering on the brink of collapse. The dollar was on life support and the whole world was watching, holding its breath. What happened next would change the world forever. Imagine this. Behind the closed doors of the White House, President Nixon and his top advisors are in a full-blown panic. A massive economic crisis is spiraling out of control, and they know they need to do something drastic. But what? Enter John Connally, Nixon's Treasury Secretary. This guy was a tough-talking Texan, not an economist, but he had something far more valuable, unshakable confidence. When European ministers complained about America's economic policies, Connally famously shot back, "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." Savage, right? But also disturbingly accurate. Fast forward to August 1971. Nixon and his advisors sneak away to a secret meeting at Camp David. And I mean secret, they told almost no one where they were going. Why? Because if the markets got wind of what they were about to discuss, it could trigger a global financial meltdown. For 3 intense days, they debated one of the most radical economic decisions in modern American history. Should they break the promise? Should they completely abandon the gold standard? Some advisors were terrified. Breaking the Bretton Woods Agreement, the cornerstone of the global economy, would be seen as America defaulting on its promise. International trust in the dollar could evaporate overnight. It could cause a tidal wave of countries dumping their dollar reserves, triggering hyperinflation. It could quite literally end the dollar's reign as the world's king currency. But they also realized the alternative was even worse. If they did nothing, countries would keep trading their dollars for gold until Fort Knox was completely empty. And then what? The dollar would collapse anyway, but in a much more chaotic and uncontrolled disaster. So they made a choice. A high-stakes gamble that would either save the dollar or destroy it. Sunday night, August 15, 1971, Nixon goes on national television to deliver what would become known as the Nixon shock. But here's the brilliant or devious part of his speech. He didn't frame it as a crisis. He didn't say, "We're out of gold, so we're breaking our promise." No, he positioned it as a bold, patriotic move to protect American workers and families from shady international speculators. He talked about jobs, about making America competitive, about standing up for the little guy. And the gold standard part? That was buried deep in the middle of the speech, almost like a minor detail. He announced the suspension of converting dollars to gold would be temporary. Spoiler alert. It was not temporary. It's been over 50 years, and we're still off the gold standard. Most Americans watching that night didn't fully grasp the earthquake that had just happened. But finance ministers around the world? They understood immediately. The next morning was chaos. Stock markets went haywire. Currency exchanges shut down. Nobody knew what any currency was worth anymore. The dollar, suddenly untethered from gold, was just floating in economic limbo. This was the moment of truth. Would other countries still want to hold dollars? Would they demand a new system? Would the dollar's value plummet to zero? The dollar was either going to survive on the strength of the American economy alone, or it was going to die. The next few months were absolutely critical. The Nixon administration had to convince the entire world that a piece of paper, no longer backed by anything tangible, was still valuable. How do you do that? The answer: power. Raw economic, military, and political power. First, the U.S. made a genius move. It made sure that oil, the lifeblood of the modern world, would continue to be priced in U.S. dollars. This was huge. If you wanted to buy oil, you needed dollars. This created an automatic, never-ending global demand for the currency. In the 1970s, the U.S. struck deals with Saudi Arabia and other major oil producers to sell their oil exclusively in dollars. This became known as the petrodollar system. Think about it. Every country on Earth needs oil, which means every country needs dollars. Suddenly, the dollar wasn't backed by gold, it was backed by black gold. Second, America had the largest, most innovative economy on the planet. American companies dominated global trade. American technology was unmatched. If you wanted to access the massive American market, you had to play ball with the dollar. And third, let's be honest, America had the most powerful military in the world. There's a saying, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Any country thinking about challenging the dollar had to seriously consider the consequences of getting on America's bad side. But even with all these advantages, it was still a nail-biting time. Inflation spiked, the dollar's value swung wildly. There were real fears that other nations would band together and create a rival currency. France tried to rally Europe. Middle Eastern oil producers discussed pricing oil in a basket of different currencies. The dollar was under attack from all sides. And yet, it survived. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Not only did the dollar survive, it actually became more powerful. I know, that sounds insane. How does a currency that just broke its most fundamental promise end up dominating the world even more? Without the gold standard holding it back, the U.S. gained incredible flexibility. It could adjust interest rates and print money to respond to economic crises without worrying about its gold reserves. This agility, while sometimes misused, helped the American economy stay dynamic and resilient. Meanwhile, other countries looked around and realized they had no other choice. A real alternative to the dollar simply didn't exist. The Japanese yen? The economy was too small, The British pound? Britain was struggling. The German mark? Germany was still divided by the Cold War. The European nations wouldn't launch the euro until 1999, nearly 30 years later. And even then, the euro has never truly dethroned the dollar. Today, over 60% of all foreign currency reserves held by central banks are in US dollars. Nearly 90% of all international trades are done in dollars. It's the default currency for everything from oil to wheat to copper. Even countries that openly oppose the United States still hold billions of dollars because it is the only practical option. The dollar is just too deeply woven into the fabric of the global financial system. Now, you might be thinking, okay, cool history lesson, but why does this matter to me? Well, the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency gives Americans huge advantages. It means our government can borrow money more cheaply than other countries. It means we can buy imported goods, from phones to cars, for less. And when a global crisis hits, investors flock to the dollar as a safe haven, which actually strengthens our currency when times are tough. But this power comes with huge responsibilities. The US has to maintain global confidence. If that confidence ever truly breaks, the consequences for everyday Americans would be severe. The price of everything we import would skyrocket. Interest rates on mortgages and car loans would soar. Our standard of living could take a serious hit. And here's the thing, that confidence isn't guaranteed forever. China is actively working to make its currency, the yuan, a global player. Digital currencies are emerging as potential disruptors. Some economists believe we're in the twilight years of the dollar's dominance. Others argue its position is unshakable for the foreseeable future. Thanks to America's massive economy and stable institutions, only time will tell which side is right. Let's journey back to where our story began. August 15, 1971, a day etched in history as the day the dollar almost died. What transpired on that fateful Sunday night was, in many respects, the ultimate economic gamble. President Nixon and his team of advisors were placing a monumental bet. They were betting that the entire world would continue to trust and use the US dollar, even after its direct link to gold was severed. Think about that for a moment. They were betting on the sheer force of American economic strength, its political influence, and crucially, the absence of any other viable alternative currency to take its place on the global stage. And astonishingly, against all odds, that high-stakes bet paid off. But what I find truly captivating about this whole episode is the profound truth it reveals about the nature of money itself. All money, whether it's the dollar in your pocket, the gold in a vault, or the cryptocurrency on a ledger, is fundamentally a collective agreement. It's a shared belief system. The dollar possesses value simply because we, as a global society, collectively believe it has value. For centuries, gold held its value for the very same reason. This principle extends even to the digital age. Cryptocurrencies derive their worth solely from the belief and trust of their users. When Nixon cut the dollar loose from its golden anchor, he didn't obliterate this belief system. Instead, he masterfully transformed it. The dollar was no longer backed by a tangible precious metal. It became backed by something far more abstract, yet in the modern world, arguably more powerful: the full faith and credit of the United States. This isn't just a catchy phrase. It represents the sum total of America's economic productivity, its unparalleled military strength, its relative political stability, and the powerful network effects it enjoys in global trade. Essentially, the dollar became a proxy for America itself. So, was it the right decision? To this day, economists are locked in a heated debate over that very question. There are compelling arguments on both sides. On one hand, it unleashed a new era of economic flexibility, allowing central banks to respond to crises in ways that were impossible under the rigid gold standard. It fueled global trade and economic growth. On the other hand, critics argue it opened the door to unrestrained money printing, persistent inflation, and the boom and bust cycles that have defined the past 50 years. They say it replaced a system of tangible value with one based on political promises, which can be, and have been, broken. What we can state with absolute certainty, however, is that it worked. At least it has worked up to this point. The dollar not only survived its near-death experience in 1971, but emerged from the crucible stronger and more dominant than ever before. It became the undisputed king of global finance. But the lesson from that summer day in 1971 is a sobering one. A lesson we should all take to heart. Nothing in the world of economics is permanent. The systems that we view as unshakable, as permanent fixtures of our world, can be altered or even dismantled overnight. The promises that seem as solid as gold can be cast aside when circumstances are deemed desperate enough. So the next time you hold a dollar bill, take a moment to really look at it. Remember that this seemingly simple piece of paper has no intrinsic value. It's not a claim on gold, silver, or any other tangible commodity. Its value exists purely in the collective mind of humanity. It's a value forged through decades of American economic might, strategic political maneuvering, and the simple fact that it's the default language of global commerce. That shared agreement, that global consensus, is the invisible thread that holds the entire system together. For now, at least. This brings us to the big question, the one that strategists and thinkers are grappling with right now. What does the future hold? Do you believe the dollar will still be the world's reserve currency 50 years from now? Will we witness the rise of a new monetary power, perhaps China's digital yuan, to challenge American dominance? Or will the future of money be something completely different, a decentralized system like Bitcoin, free from the control of any single nation? Or is it possible that the dollar's network effects are so entrenched that it will maintain its top spot for generations to come? This isn't just an academic question. It has real-world implications for everyone. The currency that dominates the world shapes global power, influences the price of everything you buy, and determines the economic fate of nations. We are living through another period of profound economic transformation, and the story is still being written. I'm genuinely curious to hear what you think. Let me know your predictions and your reasoning down in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into the secret history of the dollar as fascinating as I did, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We have a treasure trove of more mind-blowing economic stories, historical deep dives, and future-focused analyses coming your way, and you won't want to miss them. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.